They told her land was just dirt, something you could measure, price, and forget. But Eliza Whitmore stood in the doorway of her weathered ranch house and knew better, because some land remembered, and this one remembered everything. The wind moved slow across the plains that morning, dragging dust over the fence posts like old ghosts passing through, and the boards beneath her boots creaked the same way they had since she was a child, since before the world decided her piece of earth was worth more than her name. 3 offers in 2 weeks, each one higher than the last, each one signed with the same neat handwriting that didn't belong to a rancher, didn't belong to a man who ever worked under a noon sun, and every time she gave the same answer without raising her voice, without stepping back, no. The town had already folded around her, one ranch after another swallowed quiet and clean, neighbors turning into strangers overnight, fences coming down like they'd never mattered, and now when she rode into town for supplies, the eyes that used to greet her would slide away like she carried something catching, something dangerous, stubbornness maybe, or memory. You can't hold ground against money. One of them had told her just yesterday, not unkind, just tired, as if the fight had already ended somewhere she couldn't see. But Eliza hadn't answered, because she had buried her brother in that soil 6 feet deep under a crooked oak that leaned west, and there were things a price couldn't reach. The letter sat folded on the table behind her, edges worn from being opened too many times, ink still dark like it hadn't aged a day, a signature at the bottom that didn't belong to her family, but claimed everything they had ever built, and she didn't need to read it again to feel the weight of it pressing against the walls of the house. Somewhere far off, a horse should have been, the kind of sound that carried easy across flat land. But there was nothing, just wind and the distant creak of loose wood and the soft, steady rhythm of something shifting that didn't belong to the morning. She noticed him before she understood what she was seeing, a shape at the far edge of the fence line where the road bent just enough to hide a man. Until he chose not to be hidden anymore, and for a long second he didn't move, didn't call out, didn't even seem to breathe, just stood there like he'd been placed in the world and forgotten. No horse, no saddle, no dust trail behind him. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Men didn't come out here on foot unless they had nowhere else left to go. Eliza's hand rested near the doorframe, not reaching for anything, just steadying, as the figure took one step forward, then another, slow, deliberate, like each one had been decided long before he made it. And when the light caught his face, she saw not danger, not exactly, but something quieter, something heavier, like a man who had already walked through every door that could close on him. He stopped just short of the gate, one hand resting against the wood as if it were the only thing holding him upright, and when he finally spoke, his voice didn't carry far, didn't need to, because it landed where it was meant to, low and certain. "They're coming for this place," he said, eyes not leaving hers, "and they won't ask again." Eliza did not move right away because men who brought warnings without horses rarely brought anything simple with them, and she had learned long ago that the quiet ones carried the heaviest truths, so she let the wind pass between them first, let the dust settle around his boots before she answered. "You picked the wrong place to stand." And her voice stayed even, not sharp, not welcoming, just enough to let him know he was not expected and not needed. But the man did not step back, did not lift his hands, did not reach for anything at his side, and that was the second thing that felt wrong, because out here every man carried something, even if it was just pride, and yet he stood there empty, like whatever he used to carry had already taken its toll and left him behind. Up close, she could see the edges of him clearer now, the way his coat hung loose like it had forgotten its shape, the dust pressed into the seams, the faint tremor in his fingers as they rested against the wood of her gate, not weak, just worn, like a man who had walked farther than he planned, and found no place waiting at the end of it. And still his eyes held steady, not drifting, not searching, fixed on her like he had come for this exact moment and nothing else. "I did not ask for your help," she said, and the words came out slower this time, measured, because something about him refused to be rushed, and for a second she thought he might leave, that he might turn and disappear back into the bend of the road the way he came. But instead he gave a small shake of his head, almost to himself, like he had already expected that answer before she spoke it. "That is the trouble," he said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of something older than the morning. "They do not care what you ask." The boards of the fence creaked under his grip, a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and Eliza felt something shift in the air, not danger, not yet, but a tightening, like the space around them had decided to listen closer. She glanced past him without meaning to, toward the stretch of land that rolled out flat and endless beyond the road. The same land that had once held cattle and laughter and long summer evenings that felt like they would never end, and now stood quiet, too quiet, as if it was waiting for something to happen to it instead of belonging to anyone at all. "You know their names?" she asked, not because she trusted him, but because he spoke like a man who had seen more than rumor, and he nodded once, slow, certain, like each name had already been carried somewhere he could not forget. "I know the man behind them," he said, and that was enough, because there was only one name that fit that kind of certainty, one man who had turned land into numbers and neighbors into silence, and she did not need him to say it out loud for it to settle between them like dust that would not lift. Eliza stepped forward then, just one step, close enough to see the lines at the corner of his eyes, the kind that did not come from age alone, but from choices that stayed long after they were made. And she searched his face for something she could place, something that would tell her what he wanted in return for standing there, because no one came this far with nothing to gain, but all she found was that same stillness, that same quiet that felt less like peace and more like the end of something already decided. "If you are here to tell me to sell," she said, her voice lower now, steadier, "you can turn around and save your breath." And for the first time, something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not surprise, something closer to regret, the kind that did not ask for forgiveness because it knew better than to expect it. "I am not here to buy your land," he answered, and the wind carried his words across the yard, brushing against the porch, slipping through the open doorway behind her. "I am here because it was taken once already, and I was the one who helped take it." The words did not land like a threat, and they did not land like an apology either. They settled somewhere in between, heavy and quiet, the kind of truth that did not need to be raised to be heard, and Eliza felt her fingers tighten slightly against the wood beside her without realizing it, not out of fear, not exactly, but because something in his voice had reached back further than she wanted it to, further than the past she kept buried under work and routine and the steady refusal to leave. She studied him longer now, not just the surface of him but the spaces between his words, the pauses that carried more weight than anything spoken, and she could see it clearer, the kind of man who had once belonged somewhere else, somewhere louder, somewhere that had shaped the way he stood even now, balanced but not at ease, like he was always ready for something that had not come yet. "You expect me to believe that," she said, and there was no anger in it, only a flat edge that came from hearing too many stories that tried to soften hard things, but he did not react, did not defend himself, and that was what unsettled her more than any explanation would have, because men who lied usually filled the silence quickly, and this one let it sit, let it stretch until the wind carried it across the yard and left it hanging there between them. "You do not have to believe anything," he answered, his gaze drifting past her shoulder for a moment toward the house, toward the open doorway where the table sat just inside, where the folded letter waited like it had been listening all along. "But they already signed papers with my name on them, and that is something that does not disappear just because I walk away." The air shifted again, subtle but certain, and Eliza felt it settle deeper into her chest, because she knew that kind of truth, the kind that came with ink and witnesses and quiet rooms where decisions were made without the people they affected ever being asked, and she thought of the letter again, of the signature at the bottom that had never belonged to her family. And for the first time she wondered how many hands had passed that decision along before it reached her door. "You are saying this land was taken before they ever came to me," she said slowly, and he gave a single nod, not dramatic, not forced, just enough to confirm what she had already begun to understand, and something in her chest tightened, not breaking, not yet, but shifting into a shape that felt harder to ignore. "They needed someone who knew the lines," he continued, his voice still low, still steady. "Someone who could walk the boundaries and make it look clean, like it had always been theirs, and I was that man." He did not look at her when he said it, and that was the third thing that felt true, because guilt did not need an audience to exist, it only needed memory, and it seemed to follow him even when he stood still. Eliza took another step forward without thinking, closing the distance just enough to see the faint scar near his collar, the kind that had healed long ago but never quite left, and she realized then that whatever he had been before this moment had not ended cleanly. It had carried forward into everything that came after. "So why come here now?" she asked, her voice quieter, not softer, but drawn tighter by something she did not want to name. "Why stand in my way if you helped clear it for them?" This time he did look at her, and there was something different in his eyes, not the weight she had seen before, but something closer to decision, like he had reached the end of a road and chosen not to turn back. "Because I did not know whose ground I was standing on," he said, and the words came slower now, each one placed carefully, "and now I do." The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt crowded with everything neither of them was saying, and Eliza held his gaze for a moment longer before turning slightly, just enough to break whatever had settled between them, her eyes drifting past him again to the long stretch of land that had carried her family through years that did not always give back what they took, and she could feel it now in a different way, not just as something to protect, but as something already marked by hands she had never seen. "Knowing does not change what is coming," she said, her voice steady again, returning to the shape it had worn before he arrived, the one that kept things simple, kept things clear, because anything else would open doors she had spent years keeping shut. But behind her, the house shifted softly, the loose hinge on the door tapping once in the wind, and for a second she thought of the letter again, of the ink, of the name that did not belong, and yet carried weight like it did. Caleb did not answer right away, and that told her more than if he had, because men who came with plans usually spoke quickly, laid things out, tried to move the world faster than it wanted to turn, but he stood there like time had already caught up with him, like whatever he intended to do would not be rushed by fear or pressure or the quiet threat hanging in the air. "It changes what I do," he said finally, and there was no force behind it, no attempt to convince her, just a simple truth placed where it could not be ignored, and Eliza let out a slow breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders settling just slightly as she turned back toward him. "And what is that?" she asked, not because she trusted him, but because she needed to understand the shape of what was standing in front of her, needed to see if it fit into the world she knew or if it would tear through it the way everything else had started to. He shifted his hand off the gate then, straightening just enough that the weight he carried did not seem to press him down quite as much, and for the first time there was a hint of something else in his posture, not strength exactly, but direction, like a man who had finally decided where he would stand even if the ground beneath him did not hold. "They will come with papers first," he said, his eyes moving briefly toward the house again, toward that doorway, toward the place where decisions would be forced into words and signatures whether she agreed to them or not. "And when that does not work, they will come with time, with pressure, with everything that makes a person feel like letting go is easier than holding on." Each word settled slow, deliberate, and Eliza felt them because she had already seen pieces of that future, already felt the edges of it pressing in, the looks in town, the quiet distance from people who used to stand beside her, the way even the land itself seemed to hold its breath some days like it knew it might belong to someone else soon. "You think standing here will stop that?" she said, and there was a trace of something sharper in her tone now, not anger, but something close, because she had spent too long standing alone to believe that one man, broken or not, could change what was already moving toward her. Caleb met her eyes again, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance, just a steady certainty that did not need to be explained. "No," he said, and the word was quiet but firm, "but it will make them tell the truth when they do." The wind moved again across the yard, carrying the scent of dry grass and old wood, and somewhere in the distance a loose piece of tin tapped against a roof in a slow, uneven rhythm, and Eliza felt something shift inside her that she did not welcome but could not ignore, because truth out here had a way of showing up when it was least wanted, and once it did not leave quietly. Eliza did not answer him right away because truth had a way of settling in slowly, like dust after a long ride, and once it did, it changed how everything looked whether you wanted it to or not, and she turned from him without another word, stepping back onto the porch with the same measured pace she had used her entire life when something mattered more than it seemed, her boots pressing into the worn wood as she crossed the threshold and disappeared briefly into the shadow of the house. leaving him standing at the gate with nothing but the wind and his own words to keep him company. Inside, the air was cooler, still carrying the faint scent of old wood and coffee long gone cold, and the table waited where it always had, steady and unmoved by anything outside its walls, the folded letter resting at its center like it had been placed there for judgment instead of reading. And Eliza reached for it without hesitation this time, her fingers tracing the edge before lifting it, feeling the weight of paper that held more power than it had any right to. She opened it again, slower now, her eyes moving over the lines she already knew by heart, the language careful, official, distant, the kind that made decisions sound clean even when they were not. And at the bottom, that name again, written with certainty, with authority, a name that did not belong to her, but had somehow found its way into her life anyway. Caleb Rourke. The ink did not tremble. It did not hesitate. It stood there like it had always been meant to. Eliza stared at it for a long second, then another, the quiet inside the house pressing in around her as the pieces she had kept separate began to settle into place, whether she wanted them to or not. And she folded the letter once more, not carefully this time, just enough to hold it together, before turning back toward the doorway. When she stepped outside again, the light caught her differently, not softer, not harder, just clearer, like something inside her had shifted into focus, and Caleb had not moved far, still near the gate, though he had taken a step back from it, as if giving the land itself more space than he deserved to stand on. She walked toward him without stopping this time, closing the distance until she stood just a few feet away, close enough that there was no space left for anything unspoken to hide. "You signed it," she said, holding the letter at her side but not raising it, not needing to, because the truth did not require proof when both people already knew where it lived, and he did not deny it, did not look away, did not reach for explanation or excuse. He simply nodded once, the same way he had before, steady and without defense. "I did," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but acceptance, the kind that came too late to change what had already been done. The wind moved between them again, slower now, carrying the sound of loose boards and distant metal tapping against itself somewhere out of sight, and Eliza felt the weight of that moment settle deeper than anything that had come before it, because this was no longer about strangers or distant names or letters signed in rooms she had never seen. This was about the man standing in front of her, the one who had walked her land and marked its edges and turned it into something that could be taken, without her ever knowing until it was too late. "Then you are not standing in my way," she said, her voice lower now, not raised, not sharp, but carrying something firm enough that it did not need to be louder. "You already did." For a moment, neither of them moved, and the space between them held everything that could not be undone, everything that had already shaped what was coming next, and Caleb let out a slow breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to show that he understood exactly what she meant, exactly where he stood in her story now. "That is why I stayed," he said quietly, and this time there was something different beneath the words, not regret alone, but something closer to resolve, something that had not been there before. "Because this time, I am not signing anything." Caleb's words did not ask for forgiveness, and they did not offer comfort. They stood on their own, simple and unprotected, and Eliza held them there for a moment before turning away again, not dismissing him, not accepting him, just placing him somewhere she could see without letting him step any closer than he already had, because there were things a person could not take back no matter how long they stood in the dust afterward. The day moved on around them whether they spoke or not, the sun climbing higher, pulling the heat up from the ground in slow waves that made the distance shimmer, and somewhere beyond the far fence a loose gate tapped against its hinge in a steady rhythm that did not belong to either of them, just part of the land continuing as it always had. Eliza stepped off the porch and crossed the yard without looking at him again, moving toward the water trough where the last of her cattle stood scattered and quiet, thinner than they should have been this time of year, and she checked the level with a practiced glance, adjusting the handle just enough to let a thin stream continue, her hands working out of habit while her thoughts stayed somewhere else entirely. Behind her, she could hear him move at last, not closer, not retreating, just shifting his weight like a man deciding where he would stand when the ground stopped feeling certain. And after a moment the sound of his boots came across the dirt, slow, measured, stopping several feet away from where she worked, far enough to show he understood boundaries, close enough to say he was not leaving. "You can stay outside the fence," she said without turning, her voice even, carrying just enough to reach him without effort. "That is as far as you have earned." There was no answer right away, only the quiet acceptance of it, and then a single step as he moved to the side of the fence line, placing himself where she had drawn the line without question, without argument, and that told her more than any promise could have, because men who planned to take something usually pushed first, tested the edges, and he did not. The hours passed in that quiet arrangement, the kind of silence that was not empty but filled with small movements, the scrape of wood, the creak of leather, the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere high above, and Eliza found herself aware of him without wanting to be, noticing the way he did not sit, did not rest, did not wander, just remained there, steady and watchful, like a man waiting for something he could not see yet. At one point, a section of fence near the north edge gave a soft crack. Under its own age, the wood splitting slightly where the grain had weakened, and before she could even turn toward it, he was already moving, not fast, not urgent, just direct, reaching the post, and pressing it back into place with careful hands, adjusting the wire with a familiarity that spoke of years spent doing work that did not belong to him anymore. He did not look toward the house, did not ask permission, and when he stepped back, he left it stronger than he found it without a word, returning to his place by the fence as if nothing had happened. Eliza watched that from a distance, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion this time, but in something closer to recognition, because there was a difference between a man who fixed things to earn favor and a man who did it because he could not stand to leave them broken, and she had seen that difference before, long ago, in someone who had taught her how to read the land like it was a living thing. The sun had begun to lean west when the first sign came, not loud, not sudden, just a thin line of dust rising far out along the road, barely visible at first, like a memory trying to take shape, and Eliza felt it before she fully saw it. The shift in the air, the way the land seemed to draw in on itself slightly, as if bracing for something it already knew was coming. She straightened slowly, wiping her hands against her skirt, her gaze fixed on that distant line as it grew just enough to confirm what it meant, and behind her, Caleb had already turned toward it, his posture changing not into readiness, but into certainty, like this was the moment he had been standing there for all along. "They do not come early," he said quietly, almost to himself, but the words carried, settling into the space between them with a weight that felt familiar now, which means they believe they already own it. The dust did not rush toward them. It moved with a slow certainty that made it harder to ignore, a thin rising line stretching wider across the horizon as the sun dipped just enough to cast long shadows over the dry ground, and Eliza stood still, her eyes fixed on that distant movement while the rest of the world seemed to quiet itself around it, as if even the wind understood something was about to cross into her land without asking. She did not reach for anything, did not step back, because there had been too many moments already where stepping back meant losing something she could not afford to lose again. And behind her, the house stood open, the door shifting softly against its hinge like it was waiting for her to decide whether she would stand outside or retreat into something smaller than what she had been given. Caleb moved then, not toward the road, not toward her, but along the inside edge of the fence, walking its length with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes tracing each post, each wire, as if memorizing the boundary all over again, not to claim it this time, but to understand it in a different way. And when he reached the center of the line that faced the road, he stopped and rested his hand lightly against the wood, not leaning, not holding, just placing himself there like a marker that could not be ignored. The riders came into clearer shape as they drew closer, not hurried, not cautious, just steady, the kind of approach that belonged to men who believed the outcome had already been decided before they ever set foot on the land, and Eliza counted them without meaning to, 1, then 2, then 4, then more behind them, figures shifting through the dust until they formed a line that felt larger than their number, because it was not just them, it was everything they carried with them, papers, claims, voices from rooms far away that would never see this place but would still try to own it. They slowed before the gate, not stopping immediately, letting the silence stretch as their horses settled, as if waiting for her to speak first, to acknowledge something she had not agreed to. And Eliza did not move, did not lower her gaze. She simply stood where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but unyielding in a way that did not need to be announced. One of the men stepped forward slightly, not crossing the line, not yet, and his eyes moved from her to Caleb and back again, measuring, adjusting, as if something in the scene did not match what he had expected to find. "Miss Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced ease, not loud, but certain, the kind of voice used to being listened to without question. "We have come to settle what has already been agreed upon." The words hung in the air, clean and polished, and Eliza felt them for what they were, not a request, not even a negotiation, but a statement dressed up to sound reasonable, and she took one step forward, just enough to place herself fully in view, her hands empty at her sides, her expression unchanged. "Nothing has been agreed," she said, her voice steady, carrying just as far as it needed to without strain, and there was a brief pause on the other side of the fence, not confusion, not hesitation, but something closer to recalculation, as if they were adjusting the script they had brought with them. The man's gaze shifted again, this time settling longer on Caleb, and something in his posture tightened just slightly, not fear, not recognition spoken out loud, but enough that it changed the space between them. "We were not told you would have company," he said, and the words were directed toward Eliza, but they were meant for the man standing at the fence, and Caleb did not move, did not step forward, did not answer right away. He simply stood there, one hand resting against the wood, his presence quiet in a way that carried further than any raised voice could have. "You were told what you needed to hear," Caleb said at last, his tone even, without challenge, without apology, and the wind moved between them again, lifting the dust just enough to blur the edges of everything for a moment before settling it back down, leaving one thing clear above all the rest. No one had crossed the fence, and no one had reached for anything. But the space between them had already shifted into something that could not be undone. The man on horseback did not answer immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any denial could have. His eyes still fixed on Caleb as if trying to place something that did not belong in the version of events he had been given, and behind him the others shifted slightly in their saddles, not restless, not uneasy, just aware that the moment had changed shape without anyone saying. It had. The wind moved low across the ground, brushing against the fence posts, catching on loose wire, making a faint hum that filled the space where words should have gone next, and Eliza felt it too, the way everything had slowed, not stopped, just drawn out like the land itself was watching to see who would speak first and what truth would be carried with it. The man finally straightened in his saddle, adjusting his coat with a small, practiced motion, the kind that suggested control even when it was slipping. And when he spoke again, his voice was the same as before, measured, calm, but there was something beneath it now that had not been there a moment ago, something tighter, something that did not quite fit. "We are here on behalf of Mr. Crow," he said, each word placed carefully, as if saying the name itself would settle things back into order, "and all documentation has been reviewed and confirmed." The name settled across the yard like a shadow that had been waiting to be acknowledged, and Eliza did not look away, did not shift her stance, but she felt it, the weight of that name pressing into the moment, because it was the same one that had been circling her land for weeks without ever stepping onto it. Caleb's hand remained where it was against the fence, fingers resting lightly against the wood, and for a moment he said nothing, letting the name hang there, letting it exist without challenge, and that quiet did more than any argument could have, because it forced the men across from him to sit with it, to feel the distance between what they believed and what stood in front of them. "Then you already know my name is on those papers," Caleb said finally, his voice low, steady, not raised to meet theirs, but not stepping back from it either, and the man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a small tightening at the corner of his eyes, the kind that came when something expected became something inconvenient. "We do," the man replied, and now his attention was fully on Caleb, no longer divided, no longer pretending this was just a matter of land and signatures. "Which makes your presence here unexpected." The word lingered, unfinished in its meaning, and Caleb gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging it without agreeing to. its implications, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. "It should not be," he said, and there was no edge to it, no challenge, just a quiet correction placed where it could not be ignored. "Because you were told what needed to be said, not what was true." The riders behind the lead man shifted again, subtle, but enough to show that the ground beneath this conversation was no longer as firm as it had been when they arrived, and Eliza watched it all without moving, her eyes moving between them, not searching for answers now, but watching the way truth revealed itself when no one rushed to claim it. The man on horseback let out a slow breath, not visible but felt in the way his shoulders settled slightly, and for a moment he looked past Caleb, past the fence, toward the house, toward the land stretching beyond it, as if measuring something he had not been sent to measure, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. "Our instructions are clear," he said, though the words did not carry the same weight anymore. "This property is to be transferred by the end of the week." Caleb's hand shifted slightly against the fence then, not gripping, just adjusting, and he stepped forward a single pace, not crossing the line, but closing the distance enough that his presence felt more deliberate, more defined, like a boundary drawn without being marked. "Then you should ask Mr. Crow who signed it," Caleb said, and this time there was no softness beneath the words, no room left for interpretation, just a quiet statement placed directly where it belonged, and why he needed me to do it for him. The silence that followed did not break, it deepened, and for the first time since they arrived, no one moved, no one spoke, and no one reached for anything at all. No one answered him, and that was the answer, because truth, when it finally stood in the open, did not need to be argued. It only needed to be recognized, and the man on horseback held Caleb's gaze a moment longer before looking away, not out of weakness, not out of fear, but out of something quieter, something closer to understanding that what he had been sent to do no longer fit the ground beneath him. The others shifted behind him again, subtle movements, reins adjusted, boots settling in stirrups, the kind of motion that came when a decision had already been made but had not yet been spoken aloud, and the dust around them seemed to lose its edge, settling back to the earth as if the moment itself had decided not to rise any further. "We will return with clarification," the man said at last, and his voice was still controlled, still measured, but it no longer carried the same certainty it had when he arrived, and that was enough, because certainty was what had brought them here in the first place. He turned his horse slightly, not in retreat, not in defeat, just in redirection, and one by one the others followed without question, the line breaking apart as easily as it had formed, until the road began to take them back the way they came, their figures fading into the same dust that had announced them. Eliza did not move until they were nearly gone, her eyes following them not with relief, not with triumph, but with a quiet steadiness that had held her long before this day. And when the last trace of them disappeared beyond the bend, the land seemed to breathe again, the wind returning to its slow path across the fields, the fence creaking softly as if it had only been waiting for silence to come back. She stood there for another moment, then another, letting the stillness settle fully, before turning her attention back to the man at the fence, the one who had not left, the one who had not stepped forward either. Caleb remained where he was, his hand no longer on the wood, his posture unchanged, but something about him had shifted, not in what he was, but in what he carried, as if the weight he had brought with him had found a place to rest, even if only for a moment. "They will come back," Eliza said, her voice quieter now, not questioning, not uncertain, just stating what both of them already knew, and Caleb gave a small nod, his gaze moving briefly across the land before returning to her. "Yes," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften what lay ahead, but not the same way. The wind moved between them again, carrying the scent of dry grass and sun-warmed earth, and Eliza felt it differently now, not as something slipping away from her, but as something still holding its ground, still waiting to see who would stand with it when the next moment came. She looked at him for a long second, measuring not what he had done, because that could not be changed, but what he was choosing now, and without another word she stepped past him toward the gate, her hand reaching for the latch, not to open it, not yet, but to rest there, to feel the solid weight of it under her palm. You can fix the south fence tomorrow, she said finally, her voice even, practical, as if the day had simply continued on the path it was always meant to take. It has been leaning for weeks. Caleb did not answer right away, and when he did, it was only a single word, quiet, steady, and without expectation. All right. The sun dipped lower behind the hills, stretching the shadows longer across the land that had not been sold, not taken, not yet, and in that fading light, nothing more was said, because out here, some things did not need to be spoken to be understood.